Salaman Absal, an allegory translated from the Persian of Jami by Edward Fitzgerald in 1904. My dear Well, or Cow L, 2 years ago, when we began, for the first time, to read this poem together, I wanted you to translate it as something that should interest a few who are worth interesting. You, however, did not see the way clear then, and had Aristotle pulling you by one shoulder and Prakrit by the other. Baruchi. So as indeed to have hindered you up this time, completing a version of Hafiz' best odes, which you had then happily begun. So, continuing to like old Jami more and more. Hafiz is a character that he didn't preserve all his poems. You know, he got rid of some of the ones that weren't as good. Rumi kept everything from what we can see, or he passed on of everything. I must try my hand upon him, and here is my reduced version of a small original. What scholarship it has is yours, my master in Persian, and so much beside. You are who are no further answerable for all than by well liking and wishing, published what you may scarce have leisure to find do fault with. Had all the poem been like parts, it would have been all translated, and in such prose lines as you measure Hafiz and such as any one should adopt who does not feel himself so much of a poet as him he translates, and some he translates for, before whom it is best to lay the raw material as genuine as may be, to work up to their own better fancies. But unlike Hafiz's best, you know, he's called Hafiz because, you know, he memorized the Quran, whose sonnets are sometimes as close packed as Shakespeare's, which they resemble in more ways than one. Jami, you know, like his countrymen, generally is very diffuse, and when he tells, and his way of telling it, the very structure of the Persian couplet, here, like people on the stage, I am repeating to you what you know, with an eye to the small audience beyond, so often ending with the same word or two words, but if the foregoing syllable secure a lawful rhyme, I don't know why some of these things are uppercased, so often makes the second line but a slightly varied repetition or modification of the first, and gets slowly over ground, often hardly worth gaining. This iteration is common indeed to the Hebrew Psalms and Proverbs, where, however, the value of the repetition is different. In your Hafiz also, not 2 only, but 8 or 10 lines perhaps are tied to the same close of 2, are 3 words, a verbal ingenuity, as much valued in the East as better thought. And how many of all the odes called his, more and fewer, in various copies, do you yourself care to deal with? And in the better ones, how often some lines, as I think for this reason, unworthy of the rest, interpolated perhaps from the mouths of his many devotees, mystical and sensual, are crept into manuscripts, of which he never arranged, are corrected, one from the first. And this, together with the confined action of Persian grammar, whose organic simplicity seems to me its difficulty when applied, makes line by line translation of a poem not line by line precious tedious in proportion to its length, especially what the sonnet does not feel in the narrative which I found when once eased in its collar, and yet missing somewhat of the rhythmical Arabic somehow, and not without resistance on my part, swerved into that easy road of verse. Now, I don't know what he means because it's supposed to be in Farsi, right? But he could be comparing to the Quran that these poets, they don't, they miss something of the style of the Quran. That's always been the challenge, is without using the Quran, how can you put forward something like the Quran? Easiest as unbeset with any exegesis of rhyme. Those little sonnets which you thought intractable, but which have their use as well as humor by way of quaint interlude music between the little acts, felt ill at ease in solemn loath to Isaiah prose. Also something in between the two, right? And had learned their tune, before even Hiawatha came to teach people to quarrel about it, till, one part drawing on another, the whole grew to the present form. As for the much bodily omitted, it may be readily guessed that an Asiatic of the 15th century of the Common Era, the 1400s, might say much on such a subject that an Englishman of the 19th, 1800s, would not care to read. Not that our Jemi is ever licentious, like his contemporary Chaucer, nor like Chaucer's posterity in times that call themselves more civil. But better men will not now endure a simplicity of speech that worse men abuse than the many more and foolisher stories preliminary to dooms to Allah and Allah's shadow, Shah, very much about up noses, eyebrows like inverted noons, drunken Narcissus eyes, and that eternal moon face which never wanes from Persia, all of which there is surely enough in this glimpse of the original. No doubt some Oriental character escapes. It's kind of weird to me in this age trying to think of the Persians as Oriental. When those 5 tribes, what you call the Persians or the Iranians, they were on one side and they pretty much influenced the Europe and stuff like this. So if you say the Hindus Oriental, those 4 tribes, that 5 tribe group, well, I mean, originally, for those groupings, but anyways, so no doubt some Oriental character escapes. The story sometimes becomes too skin and bone, without due interval of even stupid and bad. Of the 2 evils, at least what I have chosen is least in point of bulk. Scarcely in proportion with the length of its apology, which, as usual, probably discharges one's own conscience at too great a price. People at once turning against you the arms they might have wanted had you not laid them down. However it may be with this, I am sure a complete translation, even in prose, would not have been a readable one, which after all is a useful property of most books, even of poetry. In studying the original, one gets contently carried over barren ground in a new land of language, excited by chasing any new game that will but show sport, the most worthless to win, asking, perhaps, all the sharper energy to pursue, and so far yielding all the more satisfaction when run down, especially cheered on, as I was, by such a huntsman as a poor dog of a Persian scholar, never hunted with before. And moreover, but that was rather in the Spanish Ciaras. The presence of a lady in the field, silently brightening about us, like Aurora's self, are chiming in with musical encouragement that all we started and ran down must be royal game. Ah, happy days. When shall we three meet again? When dip in that unreturning tide of time and circumstance, in those meadows, far from the world. It seemed as Salaman's island, before an iron railway, broke the heart of that happy valley, whose gossip was the mill wheel, and visitors the summer airs that momentarily ruffled the sleepy stream that turned it as they chased one another over to lose themselves in whispers. And the copse beyond, do they mean corpse or are returning. I suppose you remember whose lines they are. When winter skies were tinged with crimson still, when thornbush nestles on the quiet hill, and the live amber round the setting sun, lighting the laborer home whose work is done, burn like a golden angel ground above, the solitary home of peace and love. Signs they are at such an hour drawing home together for a fireside night of it, with Ascalus or Calderon in the cottage, whose walls, modest, almost as those of the poor who clustered, and with good reason, round make to my eyes the towered crown of Oxford hanging in the horizon, and with all honor won, but a dingy vapor in comparison. And now, should they beckon from the terrible Ganges, and this little book begun as a happy record of past and pledge, perhaps a future fellowship and study, darkened already with the shadow of everlasting farewell, but to turn from you to a public nearly as numerous, with whom, by the way, this letter may die without a name, that you know very well how to supply. Here is the best I could make of Jami's poem. Abridge de Pud Attendu, says the biographer Universal. And whatever that means, here collapse into a nutshell, epic indeed, whose story, however, if else, may interest some scholars as one of Persian mysticism, perhaps the grand mystery of all religions, an allegory fairly devised and carried out, dramatically culminating as it goes on. Well, it's important to kind of put things that they're going to be like what they are in themselves. Yeah, sure. Tell us here 10 or 100 books or whatever, but you have it understandable in itself, dramatically culminating as it goes on, and told to this day. The East loves to tell her story, illustrated by fables and tales, so often as we read in the latest travels, at the expense of the poor Arab of the desert. The proper names and some other words peculiar to the East are printed as near as may be to their native shape and sound. Suleiman for Solomon, Yusuf for Joseph, etc., as being not only more musical, but retaining their Oriental flavor, unalloyed with European association. Now, there isn't a biblical name with a V or J sound, so, The accented vowels are to be pronounced long, as in Italian, Salaman, Absal, Shirin, etc. The original is in rhyme couplets of this measure. I have no idea how you're supposed to really read that. Sideways line, curved. That wouldn't think that would be like the longer sound or dip in the sound, and then the vertical line, which those who like monkish Latin may remember in do Salaman verba regis cogitat tectus intra de profundis astuat, are in English by way of asking your clemency for us and for our tragedy. Of Salaman and Absal, hear the song. Little wants man here below, nor little long.